Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about business aviation with our guest, Todd Dixon. Todd's a partner with Taft. And before Todd, we jump into aviation and talking about all the fun things that go along with private flying. Take us back. How did you get into private aviation? You're a retired lieutenant colonel within the U.S. Air Force. So take us back to how you got involved with aviation.
Yeah, so honestly, and may make some laugh, but how I first got involved with aviation was, being a kid, going to starting college and seeing the movie Top Gun one too many times. And that got in my mind about my junior year of undergrad to look into what it would take to become a military aviator. So I looked at the Navy, I looked at the Air Force, and honestly, hope I don't offend anyone, but the Air Force was what I wanted to do. So ended up getting a pilot slot with them after I graduated, went through, officer training school, flight school, various trainings, and ended up doing that. Really loved it. There were a lot of times I couldn't believe they paid me to do that job. I ended up doing it for 20 years, which, during that 20 years, we went from, Desert Storm through, wars in, Kosovo and back into the Middle East once again. So several military engagements with other countries that, I was very proud to be able to represent my country, and ended up retiring in 2009. And then from there went straight on to Notre Dame Law School, got my law degree, and decided that I wanted to focus on aviation because it was my passion. And so that's what I did from there. I landed with a firm that had a very good aviation practice. I learned a lot from that firm. My mentor left that firm and I left soon after. And here I am at Taft, Stintinius and Hollister up in their Chicago office. And the passion remains. About the only thing I get more excited about than aviation are my kids. That's how I got here. It's been a great journey. I think I'm a really fortunate man to get to enjoy that.
Awesome. So any airplanes that you flew particular that were your favorite, or helicopters, or what did you fly?
So I was a fixed wing guy in the Air Force. So I flew the best aircraft ever created, which is the F-15C model, the Eagle. Also flew a little later in my career KC-135s, and then spent a year in Korea flying C-12s. So it was a varied list, kind of jack of all trades kind of thing. But, Air Force is fun and exciting until you get up in rank and suddenly you're in headquarters and it's not so much fun anymore. Now you are glad they're paying you.
I can imagine. So that's awesome. Awesome stuff. So let's just dive in. Let's just talk about business aviation. So can you just give us kind of a high level thought on how the industry has kind of changed over the past 3 to 5 years, just where it is today, kind of where it was, and kind of how you see it here in the future?
Yeah. So, 5 years, I think 5 to 10 years, I think it's a good look back, because kind of a keystone in the chain in business aviation and, the sale of aircraft was really COVID. You really saw market change at that point. I know the first few months, they say January to March of, gosh, it's hard to even remember what year. Was that 2021? Whenever it first hit. Yeah, it's been a minute. But it was, what's going to happen, right? What are we going to do? A lot of folks I talked to, if they had a fractional share or something else, or had an airplane, they were looking to get out of it. Then there was suddenly kind of a shift, which that shift was, well, I can travel corporate now. I don't have to go through all the things you have to do to fly commercial, right? So I sort of the demand just started to tick up. And it was already a high demand. If you just look back maybe 20 years and look at how many people in companies own personal jets or corporate aircraft, you see a giant leap from then to now. And there was just like a second bit of a jump there with COVID. So you saw demand go up. You saw, manufacturers, Bombardier, Embraer, Textron, Gulfstream, of course, Dassault. And if I missed anyone, I apologize. But all start to, come out with models, and, just kind of the growth of the incremental change seemed to be a bigger and bigger jump each time. So you saw they're coming out with new models more often. Those new models have a lot of great capabilities, fuel efficiency, range, more quiet in the crew cabin, back in the cabin itself. And So you just saw just folks who had aircraft saw these, wanted more. And so where we are right now, if you were looking, say today, to go buy new aircraft from, say, Gulfstream, or Bombardier or Embraer, you're probably, if you enter an agreement now, maybe you can get fourth quarter of 27. It may go into 28. And so basically you're looking at 2.5 to 3 year wait, 3 year wait, unless, someone steps out of a position that's buying one and it becomes available. So we see that happen as well. So there's a lot of demand right now. Another spot you see it is in used aircraft, where it tends to be still a bit of a seller's market. There's a lot of demand. The supply is not quite where it's been. And what that has led to is, prices are up a bit, nowhere near where they were in COVID. People were just, paying a lot of money for aircraft during COVID, but they're still up a bit. Negotiations, it's, the seller has a bit of an advantage. It depends on when it is, really, if they do, and why they're selling the airplane. But in general, still a bit of seller's market. I think that may or may not change going forward, but with the pressure on the new aircraft market and how long it takes to get to manufacture one, it's there in stone. You can't make it any faster. And then just the limit on the number of folks that have used aircraft that want to sell them or out there. What we have seen is kind of a push, and this has been going on for years. Is, folks will go out and find aircraft that are in Europe and bring them over here, which creates, we can maybe touch on it later, but creates a lot of issues with making sure that you're getting an airplane clean title, you're getting an airplane that's been properly exported, that you're not stuck, now with the tariff, right? That's a huge concern that's rising up. So it introduces a lot of changes, but it also, there's a lot of really good airplanes over there. And I've seen more of that, and that tends to happen when the market constricts it.
So help us with, let's look at an example of a scenario where someone's just looking now to get into business aviation. If it's for private, if it's business use, is it both? What should, regardless if it's a lease or a purchase, what should an individual kind of think about those 3 or 4 things that they should look at identifying before they contact a broker or contact an attorney like yourself to help them through the process? Take us through, what should they initially think about? Because definitely it's helpful to understand that if you're purchasing a plane, your delivery might not happen for a couple of years, right? And so that's a major factor. But before we get to that, what kind of things should people be thinking about?
Yeah, there's several. I think, what do you want to use the aircraft for is I think the first. Is it an aircraft you're going to want to use for, flights to Europe? Is it an airplane you're going to want to use? I'm here in the Midwest. Is it an aircraft you're going to want to use to fly from Chicago or Detroit to Naples in Florida? There's quite a few folks who buy airplanes for that purpose. Is it going to be business use? Are you going to try to take advantage of some of the tax advantages that come from business use? And what is your budget, and how often are you going to use the aircraft? I think those are all the items that come together in making the decision. Am I going to purchase an aircraft? Am I going to purchase a fractional from NetJets or FlexJet or, the various competitors, VistaJet, et cetera? Or are you going to be able to you're going to want to use an aircraft enough that you're going to own one and have control? And, the decision can be made there either way, even if you're not going to be using it all the time, because some folks just want to have their own airplane that they have control over all the time. But you have to put all that into kind of a mix and figure out, one, if I need an airplane just for flights within the U.S., that's going to be, you're talking super light, maybe mid-sized. And then if you start talking about aircraft that you're going to want to use to go to Europe or China or Australia or wherever, you're going to have to, for China and Australia, you probably have to go to large and perhaps super mid. So it comes into that. Those are the items that have to come to mind first to figure out, one, what do I want to use this for? How often am I going to use it? What can I afford? Am I going to try to buy new or used? And it's also not just the price, but maintenance. Oftentimes your operating costs for a new aircraft are going to be a lot lower than what you would pay on a used one, but the cost is going to be much different at the onset. So those are the items that I think mostly you want to go through. And most clients come with a pretty good idea of those when I hear from them. They kind of have an idea on what direction they want to go. Either they figured it out on their own or they've talked to a broker who's kind of gone through it. But it'll come to me sometimes when those talks are still going on. And we will go through those items and just kind of work to where we want to be. I think a caution is that when you're doing this, make sure you are talking to folks that are experienced and know what they're talking about when you're getting this advice, and that, have your best interests at heart. You will see out there somewhere, someone may have an airplane for sale that isn't the right fit, but they can convince you it is. So those are things you have to, there's few and far between when that happens, but that's the kind of thing. You don't want to have buyer's remorse when you're spending the amount of money you're spending on a corporate jet. So make sure it's the one that fits and that it's one that you're going to be able to operate easily, and that you've got a plan for how you're going to do it, right? For example, if you're buying your first airplane, you may not have your own internal flight department that is going to be able to provide day-to-day maintenance, et cetera. So you're going to have to go out there and find a company to do that for you. And you're going to want to make sure that if you buy an aircraft and you're in an area that may not be adjacent to a large population center, you want to make sure that where that airplane is, there's sufficient maintenance so that each time you need to go do something, whether it be, not necessarily minor maintenance, but say scheduled maintenance, you don't have to go fly a few hundred miles away to get it done. And the airplane's not going to be gone for quite a while. Some of those you're just going to have to deal with. But for the most part, it is important to keep in mind, can I keep this airplane flying all the time? If you have just one aircraft. Now that changes when you start talking about getting multiple aircraft in your fleet. There's economies of scale, of course. Oftentimes when that happens, folks just continue buying the same manufacturer of aircraft because it's just easier to maintain a fleet that way. So those are the kind of things to keep in mind. And as you're going through the process and, and thinking about it, talking to counsel, talking to a broker, it can really help kind of crystallize the way that you want to go and how you want to operate going forward.
Yeah, no, definitely that's very helpful because I look at some of the experience I've had with exploring private ownership, 100% ownership of the plane. You get into the operations of, is the technology up to date? Are all the radar systems in the plane up to date? Then you get into the timing of pilots and when they can fly. And so sometimes you can be stranded somewhere because the pilots have to clock off because of regulations. And so to your point, a single airplane fleet versus a multi-plane fleet have different options available to you. So definitely is something that we look at when I talk with families, is to think about all the worst case scenarios of, okay, let's say a meeting is pushed back. What does that do to potential, your flight? And then even like, for example, when you're flying within weather, when can you land? Where can you not land? There's a lot of these little rules that the FAA kind of puts in place. And maybe that's probably the next place I want to kind of just talk about is, okay, we've gone to the point where we are looking at to purchase a plane or lease a plane. We've talked to someone like yourself and are talking to a broker and we're talking to a Aviation outfit that you mentioned before. So what kind of things should we be thinking about from a FAA perspective? Like what kind of issues can we get ourselves into just because we're not aware of some of the nuances of regulations?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And it's one that probably occupies the majority of my time when I'm talking to clients at the onset of this. And so there's a few things to keep in mind first, and I'll just step back 3,000 feet and then come back down to talk to when you're going to buy an airplane and you're going to operate it. We're not going to talk about 135 right now, Part 135 charter operations. You're going to operate on what we call Part 91, which is, your company's operating the airplane. They have what they call operational control, which means essentially you're liable for what happens. Right, your company is. So if there's an FAA violation or there is an accident, that's on you or your company if it's owned by your company. And that is a part that you have to keep in mind when you're structuring this. FAA rules don't allow for you to just create just an LLC called, Todd's Airplanes put it in that LLC. It doesn't have any other business and operate the aircraft, which you'll see that as a liability structure, often in real estate, et cetera. They'll just separate them out into different LLCs. That simply does not work because of FAA regulations. So what you have to do if you're going to operate it yourself, first off, is get as much insurance as you can bear, as much aviation insurance as you can bear. We always recommend $300 to $600 million in aviation liability insurance. Can't always get there on every airplane, right? Smaller aircraft, they're never going to get you there. If you are a owner flyer, an owner pilot, and you want to fly your own aircraft, and it's very seldom, unless you've got 10,000 hours, 5,000 hours, that you're going to be able to get anywhere near that number. So those are things to take into account. But to keep the FAA happy, you have to do that. You have to set it up where either for tax purposes, you have it in LLC, sole purpose LLC, that then leases it to the company that you want to operate it, or you just buy it directly in the company. There's tax advantages both ways, but I think we'll talk about tax later, so we'll get on that piece. But you need to do that. The FAA actually has a name for creating an LLC, just putting the airplane in there and operating it. They call it Flight Department Company. And it is something that the FAA has taken, they have indicated that they're going to make kind of a focused effort on that. They consider a flight department company to be an illegal charter operation because it doesn't have a business around it. It doesn't have employees that are doing something other than transportation by air. Whenever they are flying someone on that airplane, they are basically chartering it out. Also, that entity itself cannot, even if they weren't flying anyone anywhere, they can't operate the airplane because they don't meet the requirement in Federal Aviation Regulation 91501, a company that can operate an aircraft. A company can only operate an aircraft in the United States under Part 91 if it is operating that aircraft pursuant to a business, and that business cannot be operated and travel by air. So that's the kind of thing that folks often get tripped up on at the onset, because you will have, as I like to call it, the sum of all fears. When you get together in the state attorney, you get together, the CEO or the CFO, you get together other folks who are stakeholders looking at this. The estate attorney may want to really avoid any of this aircraft being operated by the company itself, because that's where all of the capital is located. But you can't do it the way you do it in real estate. Then you're going to have folks that are looking at the tax side of it saying, well, if we want to get depreciation on this aircraft, which I anticipate, if laws that are out there right now are passed, that we're going to go back to 100% bonus depreciation shortly, then you have to have it somewhat in the line of ownership to that company or owned by that company that has all the capital that you want to get the effects of the depreciation. So they really contrast with each other and fight each other on that. Not the folks, but the regulations do. The FAA says you need to do this. The IRS says, well, you have to do this. And then, your folks internally looking at liability and what we want to do with it say this. So it's really kind of what I call almost a capstone, bringing all these disciplines together and figuring out what is the best way to do this, where we're going to meet the requirements of getting tax benefits from the IRS and meeting FAA regulations. And oh, by the way, if you're publicly traded, SEC considerations as well. And then state and local tax, as well as federal tax, and depreciation, SIFLing, if standard industry fare level for flights that are personal. Those types of things.
So if we go, I'm just trying to think through this as an individual high net worth family that, let's say, there's an operating business that's non-public. And so let's just kind of step back and think about structure. So we have an operating business. Let's say it's an S corporation, and we're looking at getting into private aviation. And let's say we want to buy a plane. And we're talking about structuring this again, this is not legal advice. This is more just kind of looking through the scenarios. So if you drop this into an LLC, then does the LLC have to be somewhat related to the operating business, or does it have to be on a standalone basis, arm's length transactions? How do people think about this? Like you said, there's a lot of people who are in real estate who get into the aviation industry when they want to fly, but they treat it just like another building. They put an LLC. But help us understand, what should we be thinking about when we are having this relationship between an operating business and this LLC that houses the plane?
Yeah. So I'm going to do that lawyer saying that everyone hates. It depends. It depends on the state you're in. And it comes back to state and local tax, as well as your standing with federal tax considerations. You need to show that the aircraft, just in general, is a business asset, right? If you're going to use it for business here. So what you're going to have to do with the relationship is, if you want to get depreciation, bonus depreciation or otherwise, typically there's a company you want that bonus depreciation to go into, right? So typically you're going to have to set it up. And I'll just say what we use for our generic going in. This is what we're going to do. And then we will change it based on, the state that you're in, or if you've got needs that go outside of this, or your priorities are not depreciation so much as, as just pure getting the job done, or liabilities. More of the setup. But how we typically will go in our kind of normal starting point structure is you've got, family office. If we're talking here, right, we're talking about a family office, perhaps it's going to buy the aircraft, assuming the family office has a business of supporting, typically you'll find they do. But if not, it's going to run into a bit of problems if we're trying to do depreciation. So you may have to find a company that's related to that where you want the depreciation to go. So that's number one. Then we essentially will create an LLC under that, and that LLC has to be wholly owned, disregarded for federal tax purposes. Create that, that entity itself will buy the aircraft, and then it will enter into a dry lease or a lease that does not include pilots, and to an extent maintenance, but that one's it's a little blurrier. The big thing is pilots. If you provide aircraft and pilots to someone, even if you're a solely held company that's 100% owned by them, you are acting as a charter company. So you give them the pilots you give them the aircraft, it's a dry lease. Then from there, you lease it and you can take advantage. The reason we do that is to take advantage of state tax exemptions that you can get through what we call the lessor exemption. Most states have it. Some states do not. For example, Illinois does not. So you do it that way. You set up what we call a fair market lease rate, or get some sort of appraisal number saying what the lease rate should be. If you were doing this in the open market, then you can take advantage in your sales tax, right? That, if you're buying a $50 million aircraft, you can imagine in your taxing jurisdiction, that is not a small amount of money. You can take that and have that extended over the life of, say, 10 years or so, depending on the state's requirements. You set it up that way, and then you've got that company now, right? But the company now that's operating the aircraft, if it's where you want the depreciation to go, often is where the capital is, right? It's the one that is going to be vulnerable if the aircraft has an accident or incident. Go back to getting as much aviation insurance as you can bear. That's the key there. That is your liability protection. Keeping in mind that if you're going to be flying high net worth folks on the aircraft, what's going to happen if there's an accident, right? Because the estates are going to sue, et cetera. If it happens to hit something on the ground where there are people, you have to think about the damage that would take place there. So that can be uncomfortable, because typically in American business, we will try to move that kind of liability over to a siloed place where there's not as much assets. You just can't do that with aviation, still comply with the FAA. So we'll set it up that way. And then the key after that is you get it set up right, and then you monitor it as you go, right? Either someone internally that is staying on, that is consistent, that understands the rules and why you're doing it that way. Or, oftentimes it's just set up a call with your lawyer every year or every 6 months and just go through and see if anything's changed. But what I like to call it is a good idea police, right? You'll set it up just how it has to be, right? And then someone will come in and say, well, why don't we just move this LLC over here, without realizing the impact that it has? And I say this because I've seen it. And then you come back in and take a look at it, and it's like this. So here's your challenges. If you get audited and you were doing bonus depreciation, that's in danger. So that may get recaptured. And then also, depending on what they do, they can make it no longer, such act. The good idea police can come in and make it no longer compliant with FAA regulations. So you really have to monitor it, make sure that someone is paying attention to it. It's good to have one person in the company that knows. And if they leave, make sure they train someone else to come in. Oftentimes, that's where I see trouble with the FAA. It's something gets set up the way it's supposed to be. And as time goes on, just a little bit changes, but that little bit suddenly makes it non-compliant. We had a client years ago that They were doing what we call a time-sharing agreement, which is similar. It's an exemption to the rule under Part 91, where you can accept compensation for the carriage of persons or property. And what happened in that case is behind the scenes, someone had the idea to add an additional amount of cost to it. And under a timeshare agreement, you were very limited on the expenses you can charge. That's where the exemption lies. So this happens. It's really a paperwork mistake. And this happens. And when the FAA decided to check in, it had been going on for like 5 years, allegedly. So when they came in, it was, you're going after you because you charged more than you should have. This is an illegal charter. And we are going after you for every single flight you did over the entire statute of limitations period. So they will come in with a proposed penalty in the area of like $2.5 million, 3.2. And so at the end of the day, it didn't end up anywhere near that. Common sense prevailed. But those are the kind of risks that can happen if you do differ from what the regulations say. And it can happen very easily if you're not tracking it. You don't have someone who understands why it's there and takes care of it that way. So it's really getting that, having someone help you at the beginning, whether it be an attorney. I would recommend it be an attorney. Pilots are great folks. I'm a pilot. But a lot of times the depth of knowledge on the FAA regulations in regards to setting it up in a compliant manner may not be in their, and like a lot of pilots, like myself, you're going to think, you know it, and it can get you in some trouble and get your principal in some trouble. So nothing wrong with pilots. Again, I'm one, love them. But that can happen if you're not finding that expertise and getting at least hey, here are your risks before you go off and do it. So the key, I think, to avoiding the FAA is set it up right and keep it there and make sure that if anything at all changes, no matter how minor you may think it is, that you're going back and talking to counsel or someone who really knows how this works and getting it done. Most of the sanction, because I do defensive sanction actions as well, quite a bit. So folks will typically come to me after something has gone wrong and bring us in to take a look and see what we can fix. Most of the time it was set up properly and they differed, but there are times when it gets set up without talking to counsel and it's just illegal from the word jump and you really don't have much of a defense. So set it up right and maintain it right, and it'll save you a lot of headaches. And just one last thing on that too, really, it's not just the risk of the FAA coming in and inspecting and finding it's wrong. It is also if you are operating in a way that is not complying with FAA regulations and the FAA takes a look and decides it's an illegal charter, say that, they don't take a look until after there's an accident. And then they come in and they're looking at it and they say, well, the structure of this was such that this was an illegal charter. Well, you're going to look back then at your insurance company policy, which if you're operating only under Part 91, is going to have a very clear exclusion for charter operations, which means that insurance may not cover. So the one bit of liability protection that you had may not be there. So even if you want to, minimize the risk of being investigated by the FAA, don't do that. Then there is that very real risk. And the other part of it is when the FAA comes out and does one of these investigations, it takes them a very long time, 5, 6, 7 years. It's always over your head. And one thing they will do once they decide to pursue you for a sanction, and they've gotten approval to do so, is they will put out a press release that will make your company look bad or your family office look bad. So it will include, I've seen them include words like fraud when there's no fraud. It's just you had set this up incorrectly. So there's just a lot of reasons to make sure you're compliant with those FAA regulations and that you maintain that. And like I said, you could set it up with the sole purpose entity owning and leasing it. That's not by no means the only way to do it. I have plenty of, very large company clients, et cetera, that just have it owned directly because they don't want to monkey with the sales tax issue. They don't want to monkey with the leases, and that's fine. Just make sure you have your insurance.
So, and what I'm hearing is that this is one area you do not want to go cheap with your advisors, right? You want someone that has been through it, knows it's pretty well versed in these arenas, because something as nuanced as I heard a story of someone that a politician, a governor asked someone to use their plane. They said, yeah, go ahead and use it. And then they found out afterwards that, hey, there's a lot more issues besides the FAA. There's, campaign contributions. There's a lot of different rules. And, we as advisors to families need to kind of step back and think about these requests from families where it might sound small and trivial, but to touch base with people like, Todd and go through those concepts and those, I would say, have those conversations about this is small things, because to a trained eye, they'll pop up pretty quickly, right? And it's like you said, on paper, it looks good, everything's structured right, but the facts and circumstances are going to tell the FAA what, how to approach. And so you've talked about fractional, like 91K for private aviation. Like, what is Part 135? Like, help us understand some of the nuances between, because this is something that I didn't know going into private aviation when I was advising families, and quickly learned that there's these small nuances within how you classify flights that could really get you tripped up. So can you just kind of give us a high level of a 91 versus a 135?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So I will say this, the biggest difference between the two is, while Part 91 has some exemptions where you can provide some limited compensation, Part 135 allows you to charge to carry people and property from point A to point B. It gives you the ability to do that. Now, Part 91 is restricted by, it doesn't have anywhere near as many rules. For example, under Part 91, you had mentioned the crew duty day issue. There really isn't a restriction. Now, I would say, even if you're Part 91, I definitely have one. I have been on an airplane when I was in the military, the 26.5 hour point of a duty day, flying in the final in Greece, having micro sleep on the way down. Like, I wasn't the only one, but we were each fall asleep for a couple seconds and wake up because we were so tired. It's unsafe to have folks have anything longer than 12 to 14 hours, in my opinion. And I think it's something, no matter how bad you want to get back home, and be careful with it. It's oftentimes very difficult to communicate to a principal when he wants to get back home, but it's something someone has to do. So anyway, so they don't have those sorts of rules. The 135 does. In addition, it's going to cause issues with smaller airfields. Oftentimes, airfields it's going to change the weather conditions for landing. You're going to have to meet higher standards to operate under 135. And all that is put in place by the FAA for safety purposes. The way they view it is, they've got 135, you're getting charged, and you should have a reasonable expectation that the aircraft is flying pilots that are trained to a Part 135 standard, that it is following Part 135 rules, and that it is being operated in a way that's compliant with Part 135 regulations. So, but there is a cost to that. It is more expensive to operate under 135 than it is Part 91. And it is very seldom that companies will go out themselves and get a Part 135 certificate to operate their aircraft. I do have it happen, but in general, you will go out and contract with a company to do that for you. You will find a company that does Part 135. And Part 135, unlike, the airlines, right? The airlines is scheduled travel, right? You're putting a schedule up every day. Part 135 is what they call on-demand charter, right? It's like you call up, say, I want to go from point A to point B on this day. I want to take my family, and I want to come back on this day, and they schedule. That's Part 135 operations. So there's a big cost difference, but I will say this: what I really like about 135 operations is that liability question, that pesky question that came up before. Suddenly that switches a bit, because now the Part 135 company, the charter company, has operational control, which means that Part 135 company, and not your family office, suddenly is liable if there's an accident, an incident, or an FAA investigation. So that takes all that risk off. Now, there's a cost doing that. In addition to the increased regulations that you have to do with just operationally, and the cost of getting it, that's going to be, if you go in and engage with the charter company, they're gonna want to be reimbursed, so it's more expensive. On top of it, you're going to lose, you're going to have to spend more money, basically. But the other piece is what they call federal excise tax. And for charter aircraft, and even, commercial aircraft, right? You'll see that on your ticket if you look closely. Well, not anymore, but so there's federal excise tax at 7.5%. So say you go out, you decide to charter an aircraft, or you enter into an agreement for another company to charter your aircraft, and, they fly you somewhere and they charge you, say, 20 grand. They're also going to charge you 7.5% federal excise tax. That federal excise tax piece is a big driver of decision making when it comes to operating Part 91 versus Part 135. About 3 years ago, the IRS issued an amendment to the rule on federal excise tax, which basically said if I am the owner of the aircraft or a sole lessee, or I'm leasing it only to one party, I should say, then that entity, the owner of the aircraft or the sole lessee of the aircraft, pays for the charter, then you are exempted from federal excise tax. It's a very narrow way to go about it, but how you could structure it is, similar to what we talked about. Now, typically you don't have to worry in most states about the lessor exemption, because oftentimes if you're operating all your flights under Part 135, there will be a rolling stock or charter exemption where you don't have to pay state taxes. Not in all states, but in several. And so if you do it that way, and say you have a sole owner, say, Todd Dixon Enterprises decides, or family office, let's say I'm not quite the level of family office guy, but Todd Dixon's family office buys an airplane just straight up and then enters into an agreement with the charter company. Then as long as Todd Dixon's family office is paying the bills, then there will be no federal excise tax. However, that doesn't mean that Todd family office can then say, hey, if you want to fly on this airplane, you pay me the money and then I will pay it to the charter company. Because then Todd's family office, which does not have a 135 certificate, is an illegal charter operator. So there are a lot of rules you have to meet. There are ways to work through that and stay within the rules. There's charter broker agreements, that sort of thing. But I'm not going to get into the detail on those, but there are ways now to operate under 135 and really be exempted from the brunt of that federal excise tax. So if you're out there operating, you've had an aircraft for a long time, and the reason you haven't done 135 is because of federal excise tax, it'd be worth giving your attorney, your counsel, your CPA a call about that and seeing what they have to say.
Yeah, definitely agree. We used to do that with some of the principals of our companies who wanted to fly the private jet. We would have them cut a check directly to the operators, because we didn't want to even think about being classified as a charter company, because again, that just adds more risk to the whole equation. So yeah, I look at it when I kind of break down 135 versus 91K. I always tell people just to kind of think about, if you're looking to fly somewhere and there's inclement weather between you and the destination is just shut down, you can't fly out of your departing airport on 135. They're just going to ground you until they get clearance. 91K allows you to just take off, do a look-see as they approach the airport that they're looking to get to. Is that kind of a simple way of thinking about it, where again, 135 has these rules where you cannot just, because you on a whim, you just want to get out of town and just take off. They have the same kind of regulations as the airlines. And 91K says, hey, you're taking over operational control of this airplane, which is then taking the risk off the operator, and you can then take off. Is that kind of a simple way of thinking about it?
Yeah. So when we're talking 91K to 135, there's a couple things to keep in mind, and you hit on the big ones, right? And that's where it comes in. So one thing to keep in mind, in 91K, for those who aren't aware, it's fractional, right? And not just someone who owns multiple airplanes, but someone who is actually running a 91K operation that complies with Part 91K. We'll see that.
Those the net jets, flex jets, those type of operators.
Flex jet, yeah, those folks, those guys, they are fractional aircraft providers, right? They're either going to sell you a share down to a 1/16. That's a small share they can sell, which I think is going to be like 25 hours typically on the aircraft, or they're going to lease you a share, right? You can do it either way, and there's advantages and disadvantages really to both. So, but what happens, with 135, go back and talk about the federal excise tax issue. If you're under a Part 91 agreement with, say, NetJets, and you can elect to have the aircraft operated under 135 rules. Typically, there'll be language that will say that you get to dictate which way it will be. And I always add in with mine when I review them that the customer elects to do Part 135 unless they say otherwise. But when you're doing fractional agreements like this with NetJets, the excise tax is not applicable. It's basically just you're operating under different rules. So you can pick either one. I pick 135. And the reason I advise clients to do so is for liability, right? All the liability is now on NetJets. It's not on you. Although you have the same insurance, I think NetJets gives $600 million. I might be wrong on that. Last time I looked, it was. So there's plenty of insurance, but all the liability is on that. But you're right. If you have a 91K and you've got in there, gotten the agreement that it's going to be 135 unless you ask otherwise, there may be a time when you're going into an airfield or flying into weather that you won't be able to get to under the rules of 135. And then you can make the decision to go under 91K, keeping in mind that now you are liable. There's a couple cautions there as well. If you go into such an agreement, if you were just going in and planning on operating under 135, you could hold the aircraft in holding company, which then won't have, you're not at risk with, directly. You're not at risk with, your capital sitting in a major company. But when you do that, and you've got this sole purpose entity that doesn't have any other business outside of transportation by air, then that structure cannot operate under 91K. It can only operate under 135. So if you want to have the option to do that, then you're going to have that agreement signed between either NetJets, FlexJet, whatever provider you use, and a company that actually makes widgets or provides a service, as I like to say, which then gives then you've got real liability when you go under 91K. Again, covered by their $600 million of aviation liability insurance. So that was a good point. So thank you for bringing that up.
So we're kind of going down this little darker area of risk and that people take on when they fly. Talk about accidents and response. Like what kind of things in that area that we should be thinking about? Because we put all this risk mitigating items in place. We structure things properly. We're following the rules that the FAA. But what happens in the situation of an accident in a response?
Yeah, so, notwithstanding just the emotional impact, the tragedy of an accident happening, one thing that you have to be prepared for is what is going to happen immediately following that accident. Because I will tell you right now, what will happen is the media is going to get there quickly. If they can see any part of that airplane or figure out a way by looking at flight plans what the tail number is, they're going to find out right away, or as close as they can get, who owns that aircraft. And they're going to keep digging and may find out more. If we have experienced time when we've had clients, we've experienced where you've got media calling family members of someone that was on that airplane before they've been notified that their family member is deceased. And it's a real problem. And another thing that could happen is they start calling the company if they find out, to get an idea of, hey, what happened? And if someone answers the phone and doesn't know how to properly respond to that, it can cause a real problem. So it's something you do in your, we advise, if you've got more than one aircraft, definitely have an aircraft use policy manual that covers everything. It talks to tax, it talks to operational, it talks to maintenance, all of those things. But it will also have an accident, recovery plan or an accident response plan. Emergency response plan is what they usually call an ERP. It's going to be all right. If there's an accident, people have to know that if someone calls, this is where it needs to go to. You're going to want to have like a list of, a recall checklist. We used to use them in the military all the time, right? You need to get a hold of someone, you don't get that, and you go to the next guy and you keep going until someone answers, to know who we go to, who we send it to, who is the one that's going to talk about it, how you're going to respond to it, what you're going to do, protecting the families, making sure that you're getting the information as soon as possible so that, the local news doesn't end up going to someone who has been a widow for an hour but doesn't realize it yet. And they're the first ones to say something. So those are things. And there are companies out there. Fireside Partners is one I use. This is what they do for a living. They track aircraft. they will be someone that will let you know right away, and kind of your ERP will come into play and start executing sooner so that you can be ahead of this and have an idea on what happened before the media gets in. And I'm not labeling the media as, bad guys. They're doing their job. They may not even realize that you don't know yet. But in today's age with internet and cell phones, it is so fast how quickly this information will be back. So you need to prepare for that. You need to prepare and, have counselors available, right? That either on call or that you've got an arrangement, because aircraft accident is really just tragic and it's something that no one expects to happen. And you have to be ready to deal with that. And, and then you get to more into utilitarian things. What are you going to do after? If you've got multiple aircraft you depend on, what are you doing here? Who's on board? How did that impact your company? If it's a family office, the same thing. There's going to be even more emotion involved, because family office generally, there could be multiple family members on board here. So there's a lot that you have to pre-consider, because if you wait until something like that happens, you are not going to have time to get ahead of it before it's going to become a real, not only public relations nightmare, but people are going to be hurt unnecessarily by finding out that they've lost loved ones in an accident that they didn't even know it happened yet.
So it's interesting. You bring these things that we don't think about, right, when we get into these types of opportunities, and so let's step back and think about, okay, we're going through thinking about the use of the plane, personal, business, both. We're looking at structure, if it's in an LLC, how that relates to an operating business and use. Like when we start looking at the contracts and the agreements, what kind of things should we be thinking about? The reason why I like going to someone like yourself, you see the market, you see so many contracts in aviation, and that what market is, how and where we can push some of these agreements with the seller or with a fractional organization like a NetJets or a FlexJets. Like what kind of clauses should we be thinking about? Like two things when we were purchasing a plane, and a couple of things when we were looking at maybe leasing a fractional share of a plane.
Yeah, so I think I'll look at purchasing or selling first, right? There are certain things I look at immediately in a purchase agreement, either way, if I'm getting one to review. The first, particularly if I'm a seller, I want to look at the disclaimers. If I'm selling a used aircraft, I want to look at disclaimers to make sure it is clear that when this airplane moves on to the next party, that they are disclaiming anything that happened before they purchased. The only thing that should survive is warranty of title. So that's the first thing I'll look at when I open. I don't typically do them in the order from beginning to end. I go to these spots and look at them. The next thing I will look at are, how are we setting up delivery conditions? What, is it realistic? Does it make sense? If I'm a seller, on the seller side, is it something that I can actually deliver? Or is it going to cost me, are they asking for something that's too much? It's going to cost me too much to either fix, or it's going to cause issues down the road. One thing that always pops up in these agreements between the purchaser and seller is, what's the definition of what we call a discrepancy? Something that, if found during an inspection, has to be fixed. Sellers always want them to be limited to just those things that are airworthy. Purchasers always want them to be broader. And somewhere in the middle is where you always land, but you can go too far one way or the other. So coffee maker example that always comes up. The seller's like, well, if we're getting ready to sell this thing, I shouldn't have to fix a coffee maker, right? It's not that big of a deal. But the purchaser's like, if I'm spending this much money for an airplane, I want my coffee maker to work. So you've got that those are items you have to work through, figure out, well, I'll look at the definition of inspection discrepancy. And look, depending on what side I'm on, of course, I'm going to view it slightly different, but I do want to make sure it's market and that it's hitting what counts. Then the next thing you're going to look on either side is your right to reject the aircraft, right? If it goes through inspection, can you just decide that day, you wake up and it's cloudy, I don't want an airplane, and say, I'm rejecting it, which kind of used to be market. And as it shifted more to a seller's market, that's gone away. Or do we do a model where it's more of what we call a hard deal, where, you go enter into this, as long as we fix everything, then you have to buy it, right? Or you're going to lose your deposit. So what we land in the middle on is, we will typically use with our agreements, and I see it out there all the time, significant findings. We'll give like a limited list of items, right? If you can only reject as a purchaser if it has material damage, material corrosion, non-standard inspection intervals, things along those lines. And they get tailored to each deal. Some folks say if it costs more than this amount of money to fix discrepancies, or if it's going to take longer than 90 days to return the aircraft to service, those sorts of things, kind of go back and forth on those. So those are key parts, because inevitably what will happen is that someday, at some point, if there is a dispute, your client is going to want to ask the question, hey, can I get out of this deal? And you want to make sure at the beginning that you've set it up in a way that, hey, one, you're explaining clearly at the beginning, okay, this is when you can get out, and this is when you can't, this is what you need to do. And then later, you need to make sure the agreement actually supports what you said. So those are major items. You just want to go through and make sure, again, with each agreement, that the airplane is described correctly, that you've got aircraft specification in there, so there's no confusion about what you're giving. If there's going to be loose equipment or spares, that they're directly listed out in that agreement, et cetera. So those are the things I hit on most when I'm doing this, right? Now, when we start talking about leasing, it is a different ballgame. Leasing is one that just inherently can be more challenging for a few reasons. One, you want to be careful if you're leasing this aircraft on Part 91 that the lessor is not doing what they call a sham dry lease, where a lessor approaches you and says, hey, I've got this great G280 that I can lease you. And you can go across the street here and Bob's Pilots will provide your pilots. Well, the FAA calls that a sham dry lease. It's illegal. They're basically saying that the two parties are colluding in order to provide you with an aircraft and pilots. To me, I don't know if FAA regulations actually support their position, but I can see how they get there. So you're going to want to make sure that they know what they're doing. They're following the law. And then on your end, if you're leasing an aircraft, even if it's just one for a month, keep in mind, you have to get your own pilots for a dry lease. You have to. You can't use theirs. So you need to go out and find a pilot or a couple pilots. And sometimes that's easier. Again, I'll go back to the population centers versus not. And, it's an issue that I have sometimes with FAA regulations against this whole sham dry lease. If I'm out in the middle of, rural Iowa or Indiana. Indiana's my own state, so no offense meant anywhere. I'm not going to have a number of pilots that can operate my aircraft sitting around. I'm going to have very few. And I may end up using the same pilots that the lessor used. It's just you have to make sure that it is not coordinated through the lessor. Now, if you're in an urban, more population center, it's more likely than not there's going to be several out there. So it's less of a reason. But you have to make sure that part's taken care of. And then the key, and what I look at often, is who is responsible for what. If I'm leasing an aircraft and say, I'll get lease agreements all the time, or we're going to lease an aircraft and, it's a great deal. I always hear that. And then I take a look at the language, and in the agreement, it says things like lessee is responsible for scheduled maintenance. Well, one, lessee should not be responsible for scheduled maintenance. This is a cost to you on an aircraft. And two, I need to know what the maintenance schedule is. Do I have a 48-month inspection coming up in the middle of my lease that I'm going to be paying for you here or not? So those are things that are important. And then it's really kind of division. If it's an exclusive lease, right, I'm going to have a little more grace if they want to say, okay, if something happens here, there's damage to the aircraft during the lease period, then, the lessee is responsible for paying it. However, if it is one where it's non-exclusive and they're leasing it to several people and you get to come in and use it this time, you really have to narrow that down and indicate, okay, if the airplane is damaged during my individual lease period of this one day, then perhaps I am. But then you have to look back to see, okay, what's the insurance look like? If I'm a lessee of an aircraft, am I named as an additional insured? Am I going to be covered, or am I going to have to pay for damage to an aircraft without the benefit of aviation liability or hull insurance, right? So there's just a lot you have to look to. And lease turn-in terms would be one more that I always look at. I don't like them. How I like it to be set up is I give it to you in X condition, and I give it, the lessor gives it to me in X condition, and I give it back to you in X condition, less normal wear and tear. That's simple. But when you start listing a number of things, it gets to, these guys own the airplane that are leasing it to me. How do I know that some of this, even with the inspection I may get, which is typically brief, that some of this isn't already existing? So there's a give and take there as well. and indemnities as well. You have to be very careful with those because you could end up providing an indemnity to a lessor of an aircraft that again would only be covered under insurance. So there's there's language you can put in to kind of minimize it, right? Language is going to say, liability is limited only to that would be covered by insurance, that sort of thing that you have to go back and forth on. But you do have to be careful and always beware. I will say this right now, always beware of a lease that's too good to be true, but you have to sign it in the next few days. Just be careful of those, no matter how good it may look.
Yeah, no, it's one of those areas where just work with the right people, the experienced people. Like you said, it's a capstone exercise where you have to bring in all these different disciplines between, legal, accounting, tax, insurance, right? There's a lot of different areas to look at this, and you have to look at it from a different perspective. And I think for us, when I work with families, it might work well for FAA column, but the tax implications are X, Y, Z. And so a lot of times it's a juggling act, right? Where are the levers that you want to pull? And I've always erred on the caution of when it comes to risk mitigation, that one is absolute top of the list and making sure that, everyone's safe, everyone is covered. And then we get into the FAA and the IRS. And so again, this seems like a not so easy area to operate in when it comes to these jets. And they're beautiful vehicles to be able to fly. And I look at them as more of a time machine, gets you from point A to B when you want to get there on your own schedule. And so those are always great vehicles to go through. But one thing that I wanted to just kind of cover now, like that's in the news now, this war on tariffs, and countries are being tariffed because we have been getting the wrong end of the deal for so many years. You brought up earlier in the conversation about tariffs and specifically buying planes from overseas. Can you just spend a few minutes talking about that nuance that people should, again, be aware of?
Yeah, and right now I will say this, if you write nothing down from what I say today, write this down. If you were buying an aircraft that is being delivered in any way from a foreign country, whether it be from a foreign manufacturer, Bombardier, Dassault, Embraer, Pilatus, never, ever, ever let yourself become the importer of record. Just write that down, underline it, circle it, tattoo it on your arm, whatever. Don't let it happen. So in general, the concern right now, and I've had this come up because I do have several deals for Bombardier and Embraer specifically, and Embraer is Brazilian, right? So why would I worry about that? I worry about that because you buy a new airplane, I'm not closing until 28 or 27. So is there going to be a tariff on them then? I don't know. So oftentimes when you look at the agreements, initially make sure you're not the importer of record. Make sure it is stating that the aircraft that you're buying from a foreign manufacturer is being imported by that manufacturer. They're the importer of record. So when you buy it, it is yours. You're buying it in the United States. It's a United States aircraft. It has already been imported. All of that is taken care of. And there's nothing in the agreement that indicates that you're responsible for any kind of import duties or export duties if you're closing in the U.S. That has come more to the highlight now, and it's become more highlighted now, I'm sorry. And what I'm seeing and what we are doing is kind of getting more specific on that and asking if we're negotiating a deal right now, which of course, if we're negotiating a deal right now, we want to add in specific language saying, the buyer is not responsible for tariffs. The seller is. Now, the big problem there, of course, is, back in 23 or 22, when someone went under a contract for Bombardier and Embraer, two great companies. I'll put that out there. I'm not, I should just say Bombardier because there's nothing on Brazil right now, but say they were supposed to close yesterday. There's a 25% tariff on that. I think Bombardier is going to want to talk. And what I would expect they would do, I know them well, I deal with them all the time. Big fan of their sales force and big fan of their deal people, their contract folks, maintenance, all of it. But that's a big loss. What I'm expecting that they would typically do, particularly for having these, you've got tariffs today and not tomorrow, or however you want to view it, just delay the closing. I think both parties would be happy with that. Now that becomes a problem if it is a persistent tariff, right? If we just went 25% tariffs on Canada and just kept them there, you can't really delay it. So my concern has always been, what I would do if I was a seller and that were happening is if suddenly there were a 25% tariff that I had to bear, I think the cost of walking away from the agreement is a lot less than doing that. So they could potentially do that. If it gets put on the buyer again, the cost of walking away may be better. So I think both are kind of encouraged and motivated to find a way to deal with the problem. So it's a challenge, not just because what will happen, but what folks are concerned will happen with tariffs, right? It's, you don't want to sign up to a deal and have the thought in the back of your head that I may have to say a 25% tariff on a $40 million airplane. I don't want to have to pay another. I want my attorney to tell me there's no chance that I'm going to be paying an extra $10 million on this airplane. And so we need to be able to make sure that's the case as much as we can, with the seller having the same thought on their side. We don't want to have to bear all this. I'm hopeful that this isn't going to be a long-term issue, but we still have to plan like it is. And I would expect we're going to see changes in agreements from both sides on how to deal with this. And really kind of, I looking at agreement the other day, and it was really clear that the seller's responsible for all import duties, fees, all of this. But what just kept nagging at me is it never said the word tariffs. And what is a tariff? Is it a tax? Is it a duty? So I just worry someone could find a way to drive through it. So just be cautious, but just again, never let yourself become the importer of record. Same thing will go with used aircraft, but there you're not going to be dealing with the same level of, say, like I said, Bombardier. I guarantee they've got a whole army of folks looking at this problem right now, trying to figure it out because they're seeing it happen every day. If you deal with the seller of a used aircraft and it falls under the tariff rule, you're not going to have that. This may be the only time they've ever dealt with it. So there's good and bad to that as a buyer to deal with. But again, the hope here is that this is going to be a temporary thing. It's going to go away. And hopefully if it does come back, it will be short term or minimized, or, fingers crossed, similar to what just happened to automobiles. I think earlier today or yesterday, corporate jets will be excluded. But I think you also have to look at what's the price impact going to be, because I can tell you right now that, Bombardier, Embraer, Dassault, they're importing parts from the US to put on that airplane from, say, Raytheon or wherever, right? So how's that adding to the price of the aircraft? How's that going to price up when they go to sell it later and they're dealing with not just tariffs from the United States, but in Bombardier's case, tariffs from Canada? So that could change some things in price. That could change pricing and similar items as well. So that's something we're really kind of throwing our arms around right now and trying to work through. That I think needs some attention, and I expect there'll be a lot of people looking at it, analyzing it, figure out the best way to go, and it'll get normalized like everything else.
Like you said, key is it's the delivery date, not the contract date, right? So that's something we have to always think about, is the delivery, that nuance of not knowing, like you said, 2 years from now when you're receiving that plane, looking at what the tariffs could be. So I wanted to just kind of, as we're getting kind of towards the end here, this great conversation. I do appreciate Todd getting on and talking through some of these areas within the business aviation world. Is there a story or scenario that you kind of relive and think through, like more often than not, of past experiences with a particular client that well-intentioned, but just kind of missed some of the, I don't know if it's recording or accounting or structure that just didn't think through it, and they kind of just jumped through the hoops after the fact because now they're in trouble. But is there something that sticks to your mind of, or a repeatable theme that people, as small as it might sound, is something that is big? Because I look at this world again where you have the tax world and you also have the IRS, and you have FAA, right? And it's this game of playing between the two of them, making sure that you're never in between and getting pinched. Is there a scenario that you've seen where it's like, I tell this, like you said here, and you want a tattoo on your hand, do not be the importer, right? On record, right? That's key. Is there any other scenario that you've seen that people should be aware of?
Yeah, so I won't talk to anything my clients have done, but what
Please,
I will
share
talk
names.
to,
Come on.
or scenario, I will talk to scenarios and things that I have seen, whether it be, some where I've, seen it happen or watched it from afar or been involved. But, there's certain things, you bring up tax, and, where I'll go is one of the two, I would say, two states that are the most difficult to deal with tax wise for corporate aircraft are probably not a surprise. It's Illinois and California. And Illinois, mostly in Chicago is where you're going to see most of what pops up. And so the one thing Illinois does have is a very, very strong rolling stock exemption that basically is if you charter the aircraft 50% of the time or more, you don't have to pay state sales tax in the state of Illinois, which is not a small amount of sales tax. So a lot of folks take advantage of that for good reason. And there are forms you have to fill out. I mean, believe it or not, there one form you have to fill out. You have to get the originals from the Department of Revenue in Chicago and keep them and use that particular form that's got a number on it to kick it off. So our firm has like a collection of them that we keep just for that. But if you don't set it, basically you have to set it up right. You have to file for the exemption at the beginning. If you don't do that, it doesn't matter what else you do, right? So you have to do that piece right. Then as you're going, you have to make sure every year that you are getting 50% or more in charter, which sounds easy, but what happened during COVID and what happened during government shutdowns is that suddenly, when you buy an aircraft, the first thing you have to do is get it on what they call an operational specification, call an OPSPEC, for this charter company that you're going to engage with these flights. In the past, that could take maybe a month, maybe less. When COVID hit, it started stretching out to longer and longer. And then when the government shutdown happened, it would take longer and longer than that. So you could get in a spot, particularly if you don't have a reputable charter company, where you have that first year and you have to keep like a rolling year, right? So you buy that airplane October 1st of 2024 for that rolling year until September 30th? Yeah, September 30th of 2025, you have to have 50% charter use. So you sign that, you buy the airplane, you bring it in, you apply for it. Your charter company doesn't get you on the OPSPEC for 8 months. You've been operating at Part 91 that entire time. You better, in those last 4 months, just do every flight that you have charter, even if there's going to be federal excise tax involved. Unless the money doesn't balance out right and you better pay the taxes, but I doubt it's going to. That's something that I saw capturing a lot of people. And I think it is patently unfair because the FAA just couldn't get it done. I will say the Chicago Department of Revenue did work with us on those things, but when it came down to it, there was a rule that had it wasn't met. So that happens, and you have to continue doing it year after year. So it's something you have to kind of bake in. The unfortunate thing is oftentimes when you buy an airplane, you can't just say, hey, let's get this ready to put it on the OPSPEC now so it's ready to go. You have to wait till you own it. So that's something that I have seen capture people, and it can capture people in other states as well if they've got similar rules. So the rolling stock exemption is great. But one thing I will tell clients is these tax exemptions are not a right. It is something that you have to qualify for and you have to meet those requirements. And I've seen some bad results from the charter issue happening where the client couldn't have done anything any better. I've seen bad results where they didn't properly the exemption at the beginning and then they followed the rules and nothing. And of course it was a problem. That's one you can sometimes overcome. But I've also found them, I've had examples where they didn't set it up correctly and they didn't follow the rule. And they've got these tax bills can be massive. They can be over $1 million, right? Suddenly they're stuck and they have to pay it. And then you make the decision, do you want to fight when it may not be like that? So that I think is a big one that I've seen. The other one, if we just go to like FAA operations and that kind of issue, really, just when you're going through, set up the flight department right. What I've always said is you'd rather pay your attorney, $2,000, $5,000, $10,000 now than pay Uncle Sam, $2.5 million later because it's not compliant. Same thing with tax and the rolling stock, right? Make sure you've got someone looking at it, CPA, attorney, someone who knows aviation, because it is different. Looking at that, it can save you money later. But some of the things I've seen happen on the operational side, and I kind of talked about one a little bit, is if you're going to do one of these exemptions, make sure you understand the rules, right? If you're going to do a time sharing agreement, know what you can do. Make sure that all the decision makers know what they can do. Make sure you're paying attention so that if it does start to wander off, you can fix it, right? And one thing I have seen just that happens on occasion is, my buddy Fred at the pool, right? You're at the country club, whatever, you're advising your client on X, Y, and Z. You need to, you have to set it up this way. The big one is you can't just pay for, if you've got a company airplane, you can't just pay for the flights. It's not legal. But, my buddy Fred at the pool has had 4 airplanes and he says it's fine. Well, your buddy Fred didn't get caught yet. So, I run into that often. It's not always Fred. It's usually someone by the pool or at the country club. But those are the kind of things that really just, sit down, look at it. I will say this. I was advising talking about the SEC portion, which probably isn't really relevant on the family office, but I had a bank as a client and they had asked us to take a look at their SEC filings regarding personal use of the aircraft and all this kind of thing. And so we gave them some advice and they sent us an example from another, they actually sent us from another bank that they knew. And I took a look at the other bank and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is not compliant at all with what you have to do. So I gave them my advice and said, look, this is what you have to do. We drafted it up. And lo and behold, a year later, I take a look at the SEC filings for the other bank they had set as an example, and it looks almost exactly like the one that I provided to my bank. So it's just because someone, and the reason I say this is not to say, hey, check me out. It's more to say, sometimes even people who have been doing this in companies, sophisticated ones that have been doing it for a long time, may not necessarily be right. So just don't look to them. Find out the why or talk to counsel to see if, hey, does this work?
No, that's definitely good things to hear. And real quick on that, on the exemption, is it one of those things where once you trip it, is it hard to get back, can't get it back? Or is it something that there's some remedies that, like you said, you can work with the department to get the exemption back?
It depends. For the most part, once you lose it, it's gone. And that goes for just the simple lessor exemption in a lot of states, right? But with the rolling stock, unless you can sit down and talk to the folks in DOR and say, look, this is what happened, we've rectified it, you might get something. But what it comes down to is, and trust me, the folks I deal with at DOR in Illinois are fantastic, but it gets to a certain part where and they have no power over what happens next. But if 1 year you miss the rolling stock exemption, you're paying tax on the airplane. I don't care if it's year 1 or year 5. You're going back and paying tax on the airplane. So you do have to keep with it. Most charter companies that operate, and I'll use that because that's the one I see most often used. Lots of other states have them, but Chicago's just a big one. Or Illinois, I'm sorry, is a big one. So what I'll see often with that is, like I said, you set it up and then you don't follow it and you'll lose it and it's gone. And people will be surprised by that. It's my job to make sure they're aware of what could happen. But like I said, it's a right. It's not a right, something you can qualify for. So be careful there. But on leasing, right? Most states, again, there's a few that don't have this lessor exemption. And with many of those states, I'll use Michigan, where I live. I work out of our Chicago office, but I'm over here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Here, if you set this up and say you miss one lease payment, right, of this fair market rate, then you lose the exemption. You have to pay full tax. That's one you can sometimes work on them on. But the other part of that with the lessor exemption is typically with those, you have to state and operate and say that the only thing we are doing with this aircraft is leasing it. So say that you go out and you get the aircraft, you don't enter into the lease right away and you do a couple flights on it. You may have just, if they dig around enough, you may have just destroyed your lessor exemption. Also, if you bought the aircraft in a sole purpose entity and planned on leasing it and you operated it before that lease was in place, guess what you've also done? You've also broken FAA regulations. So getting it done right, and then kind of making sure that you're keeping with it, because it will just undo the whole thing if in many cases, if you miss a month. So it's just really important to keep that in mind. And keep reminding folks that, look, I've said it a few times, maybe that needs tattoo as well. But whether it be an FAA exemption of what you're doing or a tax exemption, it's not your right that you get it. It is a qualification that if you maintain what you're doing, then you get it. Similar to like a driver's license. You don't have a right to a driver's license, but if you follow the rules, you can keep it. So you have to keep those things in mind. And sometimes what I see is that is such minutia in the oftentimes that it's not really noticed where it needs to be noticed. And it can be.
Yeah.
But
No,
in
it's
general, look,
awesome.
I've said all this, oh my God, all this stuff can go wrong, taxes, that you could have an accident. It doesn't happen in 99, stuff we've talked about today doesn't happen in 99.99% of the folks who are operating here, right? So it's a great thing to get into. The time you're right, it is a time machine. The efficiency it adds to, say, a CEO to where you can actually get to places, get back, is immeasurable. And that's why the tax code is written as it is. So it's a great business asset to have. All you have to do is just follow the rules, follow them right. Don't take shortcuts. As I was told before, my very first check ride in the Air Force, when I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed 22-year-old, and I walked up to my instructor and said, "Sir, what's the key to passing this check ride?" He said, "Know everything and don't screw up."
Yep,
That's it.
exactly.
Do it right.
And I think
Don't mess it up.
I agree. That's a great way to kind of, as we put this conversation to an end here, I think that's a great way. Is like, it's the rules are there, right? There's the checklist, but except for the couple of tattoos that we have to get now, because Todd
Yeah.
says we have to get tattoos. What I hear is, if you're getting into the space, there's all the benefits, like you just said, of being a time machine, but really just understanding your use of the plane and how you want to approach that. Also engaging just smart people around you, just that knows this stuff day in, day out, and having that team member on staff that just has that, I think, that continuity of just understanding how we structure these entities. Because like you said, just because we're moving an LLC over here because it makes sense from an entity structure standpoint, might trip you up when it comes to the FAA. So I think, to your point, just the rules are there, just follow them, don't screw up. And your aviation experience should be pretty well documented and have fun doing that. So any closing remarks before we shut down here? And again, where can people find you on the website and LinkedIn and whatnot?
Yeah, so I'm going to be leaving behind with you a document. Maybe we can link it to the podcast that has my contact info. And it's what it is it's a little table of summaries, or a summary and table of categories for flights, business flights, et cetera, I find it to be pretty helpful as far as determining when you want to do, bonus depreciation, such, kind of giving you a guide on. It's 2 pages, so it's not comprehensive legal advice by any means, but it'll give you a guide on, okay, these are the kind of flights that are going to be business flights. You're going to count towards what I need to depreciate or deduct, and these are the flights that aren't. But I'll have my bio on there and a QR code on the back that you can just link up to.
I appreciate that tool. I think that's something that's be useful for people to listen to this conversation and just kind of a takeaway to high level, just kind of give them things to think about as they approach this process of getting into the business aviation space. So Todd, again, this has been fun. I'm glad you're able to carve out some time. I do appreciate it. And I think this has been very educational for a lot of people. And hopefully people can take away from this and just appreciate, I think, the details that go into the aviation space. So again, Todd, thanks. Hey, thanks for taking the time and hanging out with me today.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this time. It was good to talk to you.